Let me read to you a passage from the 7th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel, verses 11 to 17. It's the Gospel for the 10th Sunday of Ordinary Time, Year C. St. Luke writes, "Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, 'Do not weep.' Then he went up and touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. He said, 'Young man, I say to you, get up.' The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. And they were all filled with awe and praised God. 'A great prophet has appeared among us,' they said. 'God has come to help his people.'" That's from Luke chapter 7, verses 11 to 17. What does it suggest to us? Well, of course, it suggests thoughts about death. You know, the two greatest events in the life of any person are his birth and his death. Of the two, the greater was his birth, of course. Of his birth, he has no recollection. He could not prepare for it. He had no say in its happening. He was completely at the disposal of events in respect to it. It is only gradually that he learns that he did come to birth. But everything pivots on its having occurred. He would be nothing, and would be no reference point for anything at all, with no prospects ahead whatever, had he not been born. If he reflects at all, he will sense that because of his birth, there has been placed in his hands a tremendous responsibility which he did not ask for, but which is unavoidably his. If he does not take up his life and make of it a great work with the time he has, then his life will be tragic. If he does assume responsibility for himself and pursue a course of rational and moral choice, then happiness will be his. The most significant thing in the life of every person is that he was born. Now, what is the meaning of it, though? That is to say, what is the meaning of life? If he does not attain the answer to this, how will he know how best to live? In fact, the answer is inextricably connected with the second most important event in the life of every person, which is that he will die. Sooner or later, he sees around him people who die. And that is the end for them. He hears it said that everyone dies, and is told that he too will die. And he comes to be convinced, when he is young, hopefully, that this indeed is the case, that he will die. He was born into this life, and he must die and pass away from it. The realization of this coming event, the greatest he must face, leads him to ask, what will happen to me after my death? On the face of it, death is a simple black hole. A person lives his life and comes to die, and then he is gone. All his friends are helpless before this event, as is he too. At most, he and they may postpone it, but it cannot be avoided. It is the greatest event to be faced, and it is the one that looks most devoid of meaning. Whatever one makes of life, death tears it all away and leaves little to show. Our Gospel today that I read earlier from Luke chapter 7, verses 11 to 17, places us in the scene of the widow of Nain leaving the town with the body of her only son. Her son has died, and the light has gone from her life. There have been any number of attempts to understand the meaning of death, It is a major issue for the religions of man and for many philosophical systems. But in the last analysis, what certain knowledge can man have of what has happened to those who have died, and of what will happen to himself after he dies? He hazards a guess and stakes the course of his life on it by not caring, or, say, by being very religious. But what a boon to know for certain what is to be made of death. Ah well, in this, as in all things, Christ is the light of the world. Jesus Christ was born, and how great an event was the birth of the eternal Son of God. And the principal thing he came among us to do was to die. His greatest achievement came in his death. By dying, he turned the world around, as it were. It was the greatest work he accomplished, and by means of his death, he took away the sin of the world and reconciled it to God. Through his death, he attained his glory, rising with a new life that is forever beyond the reach of death. And, wonder of wonders, he shares this risen life with us at our baptism. By means of our baptism, we have shared mysteriously and sacramentally in the death of Christ, and we share his life now. Our grand task is to grow in this divine life. Every time we die to sin and self, in union with Jesus Christ, this eternal life granted to us at our baptism grows the more. If we die in the grace of Christ, then our physical death completes this daily dying with Christ and union with him. Thus death is now no longer a great black hole, but the greatest and most positive thing we can do. As it was with Christ, so in the case of each one of us, death is a call from God to unite ourselves to his holy will. In union with Christ and with his grace, we can make of this greatest event of life the greatest act of loving obedience to God. Death is the crowning act of all life's acts, the one above all to be prepared for every day of our lives. At our baptism, Christ does for our souls what he did for the dead young man of Nain. He raises us up. But in baptism, he raises us up from the death of original sin to life in him. This new life, a share in his life, must be resolutely lived by following in the footsteps of Jesus Christ, and his path is that of self-denial in doing the will of the Father. A great event is coming for every one of us, just as it was coming in the life of Jesus Christ. That event is our death, and it is an event full of possibilities and fruit, provided we meet it with the mind of Christ. It is the greatest moment of surrender to the will of the Father that is open to us. So much hinges on it. Let us prepare for it every day by leading a life of obedience to God in the little duties before us, in union with Jesus Christ.